If you have been reading online what the men's rights movement is saying, or if you have been listening to previous speakers at international conferences on men's issues, you'll be aware that when a speaker talks about what is going on in their country, they could almost be talking about your country. The details will vary, but the overall change in society is heading the same way. What I am going to talk about may change your outlook on the struggle for men's human rights, dignities and freedoms. It will make you think differently because you will not and should not forget the need to think outside your national borders. I am going to explain why there is a push in your country to stop violence against women, but no laws to specifically stop violence against men, even though everybody knows that men suffer more violence than women. I'm going to explain why there are laws appearing around the world that make misogyny a hate crime, but do not make misandry a hate crime. I'm going to explain why your country is concerned about the education of girls, and even the further education of women, despite your country having a worse track record of educating boys and men. I'm going to explain why men in your country do not get equality under the law. I'm going to talk of all these things and more, but only in overview. I don't have 5 days to talk about all this, nor even 5 hours. I want you to hear what I have to say and understand the global nature of misandry and societal destruction that affects your nation, your city, you. We all know that there are international organisations. We hear of supranational and global meetings and actions in the media. We have heard of NATO, the World Trade Organization, G7 and G20, the World Bank, COP26, the OECD, the International Criminal Court, and most of all, because it actually encompasses many other global bodies, we have heard of the United Nations. In this talk, I am going to focus on the United Nations. Most other international bodies are part of, or partners with, the United Nations. It is by far the largest and the most influential of the international organisations in your daily life. Yes, your life, daily. As one of our allies, United Families International, say on their website, some people may think the United Nations is far away and disconnected from their life and their family, but what happens at the UN does not stay at the UN. It influences families and policies across the world and close to home. Not everything in your life has been determined at international level, and not everything is as international as you might think, but a surprising amount has been decided at an international level. The decisions are passed down to a national level by a combination of treaty, standards, conformity, coercion, and law. Treaty is where your government has agreed to go along with something, such as the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most countries have signed hundreds of treaties and sign a few more each year. Standard setting is a way to ensure the world works in the same way, which is why your watch might show a different hour to mine, but changes to a new hour at the same moment. Hidden conformity usually occurs on complex matters where national or regional bodies don't have expertise or the money to resolve a question for themselves. There might be a national body, but they will rely heavily upon what other experts say. What the international body says, the national body parrots. It is impossible to keep an eye on what every UN agency is doing, which is how come, for example, abortion is increasingly being seen as a human right for the mother, rather than for the child, even though this has no official standing. Coercion is applied to the most powerful countries as often as the least powerful. It varies from an unwillingness to trade unless certain conditions are met, such as action on modern slavery or introducing special education programs for girls, to international displeasure that makes it hard for a country to get along in the world. Law is created at an international level and recognised or imposed on every nation. This is largely carried out through the International Criminal Court and can effectively enforce definitions of what things like gender and baby mean, even in your country's legislation. The reality is that no developed nation can get by without the financial structure and civil acceptance of the UN. Nor can most nations afford to upset the international agreements arranged by the UN. And no underdeveloped nation can improve without the handouts and other aid from the UN. And none of the others want to risk the loss of, say, tourism by having their heritage monuments downgraded by UNESCO, or their nation's reputation damaged by a negative report from UNFPA. Yes, these things go on, and I don't believe in coincidences, not when I see too many coincidences. If one of the councils of the UN wants something to happen, which means the UN feminists want it to happen, then a country will think twice or more before going against it. A few days before Christmas 1993, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed Resolution 48104, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. You can be forgiven if you don't know already that men suffer more abuse and violence than women do in every nation. Few people would not want to reduce the violence done to women. That isn't at issue and never should be. The issue might be that sexist policies will always do harm, or it might be that draining limited resources away from violence done to one part of society has long been seen as a way to increase violence against the part of society that isn't getting any help. We'll take a look at how this one small example of global sexism against men and boys developed. I'll start halfway into the story and show how what the United Nations began spread to almost every country in the world. 1972, UN Resolution 301027 proclaimed 1975 as International Women's Year. 1975 to 85, the United Nations declared the Decade for Women. 1975, Mexico City, 133 governments defined a World Plan of Action, which included hundreds of goals, plans and resolutions specifically about women. Speakers included the International Atomic Agency and the World Bank. This included a recommendation to all governments to introduce effective measures for the prevention of all forms of cruelty against the well-being of women. 1979, Catherine McKinnon published her influential text, Sexual Harassment of Working Women. 1979, UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW. 1981, a small group of feminist activists create the Dalit model of domestic violence. 1980s, scholarly reports and studies, mostly funded by UN, on violence against only women. Women's fears of violence raised, even though violence against women was often going down. 1993, UN Resolution 48104 to eliminate violence against women. 1994, UN Commission on Human Rights Resolution 1994/45 appoints a special rapporteur on violence against women. 1994, United States passes its first Violence Against Women Act, a federal law setting up the Office on Violence Against Women. 1995, United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women. The Beijing Declaration includes a strategic objective to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence against women. By the way, in case you're wondering, there has never been a United Nations Conference on Men. This is a conference that, among other things, defined what gender meant for the world. 1996, Italian Law No. 66, specifically on sexual violence. 1997, the Lebanese Council to Resist Violence Against Women established. 1998, Sweden brought in Law 55, defining gross violation of women's integrity into the penal code. 1999, the USA passes a version of the Violence Against Women Act that starts to fund feminist groups across the country. So little of this money reaches anyone in need of anything that it should be a national scandal, but only corners of the men's movement are even aware of it. $1.6 billion was allocated towards investigation and prosecution of violent crimes against women. 2000. The Council of Europe issued their paper on violence against women. Even some feminists found the infamous statement hard to swallow that every day in Europe 1 woman in 5 is a victim of violence, although that has now become accepted fact in some circles. 2001. Bahrain created the Bahraini Supreme Council for Women, with one of its main concepts being to end violence specifically against women. 2001. Philippines mandates the National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women to strengthen its oversight functions in implementing measures to curb violence against women and direct government agencies and departments to follow through. 2002. Panama's Executive Decree No. 53 came into force, declaring equal opportunities and putting measures into place to fight against what they call gender violence against women only. 2003. In Australia, both Queensland and New South Wales brought in measures to combat specifically violence against women. Like every other country, there is no measure to address the bigger issue of violence against men. 2004. Philippines passes its Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act. This is actually one of the most sexist, discriminatory and ultimately unhelpful pieces of legislation in the world, though Bangladesh's 2000 Act was so bad that even feminists were admitting it made things worse until it was changed in 2013. 2005. India brought its Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. Children, as well as females, have legal protection. 2006. UN Resolution 61/143 passed without a vote. Intensification of efforts to eliminate all forms of violence against women. Among other things, this elevated all violence against women as a violation of human rights. This sees no problem with the statement. States should take urgent and concrete measures to secure gender equality and protect women's human rights. 2006. The Austrian Code of Criminal Procedure amended to provide women complainants of violence specific privileges and rights not accorded to men. 2007. Mexico passed a law on access of women to a life free of violence. This might be the first time that misogyny was made illegal. Like many such laws, in the midst of granting women special protection, it insists upon legal equality between women and men. 2008. Guatemala femicide law specifically criminalizes murder and violence done to women. 2008. A United Nations committee reporting that numerous gaps and challenges remain in legislation to address violence against women drew up guidelines for developing legislation on violence against women. Specifically, this excludes protecting anyone not a woman, stressing that laws should be gender sensitive, not gender blind. This is where the concept of specialist courts and special training for judges starts gaining ground around the world. The issue of family violence courts was raised in the Scottish Parliament in October 2021, for example. 2009, Kazakhstan introduced a new domestic violence law that brought in funding and interaction with feminist bodies. 2009, again, Nepal's new Domestic Violence, Crime and Punishment Act brought in penalties for harm to personal properties of women only. 2009 still, the Parliament of the European Union issued a resolution to eliminate violence against women, specifically blaming men. This greatly reflects a paper written in 1997. 2010, the French Parliament adopts Law 2010/769 on violence against women. 2011. The Istanbul Convention was created, a collection of guidelines complete with taxpayer-funded compliance inspectors, which embodies radical feminist ideals and severely impacts upon the human rights of male citizens in every country that agrees to it. So far, 45 countries and the European Union has signed up to it. Turkey has denounced it, and Bulgaria's constitutional court has ruled it to be unconstitutional. 2012 Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act is introduced in Australia. Among other groups, this specifically offers protection to women. If you are middle-aged or white man, tough. In 2012, in Israel, the Knesset passed the Welfare Services Law 5773/2012, which specifically provides funds to women who have stayed in a shelter for more than 2 months, even though the law allows a man to be kicked out of his home on mere accusation. 2013, South Africa beefs up its national policy framework for women's empowerment and gender equality. 2014, the Asia Foundation launches Ending Violence Against Women programme in Timor-Leste, where for every 2 women killed, there are 7 men killed. 2015, Wales passes the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act. 2015, no list could be complete without the statement made at a conference on domestic violence in San Salvador by Hillary Clinton. Women have always been the primary victims of war. Men going off to war to protect their country is apparently a form of domestic violence to women. 2016, China updates its anti-domestic violence law. This provides a legal framework for feminist bodies that claim to help in such work. 2017, Tunisia passed a law to expressly address violence against women. 2018, Ireland brings in its Domestic Violence Act. In the statute, it is entirely sex-neutral, but the Irish government makes it clear that this is implementing the Istanbul Convention, and as such, they are only interested in women victims. 2018, Korea introduces its Prevention of Violence Against Women Act. Korea is one of the keenest countries to implement United Nations policies, so this law is fully gynocentric, if not misandric. It includes a requirement to educate on preventing violence against women from a perspective of gender equality. 2019, the International Labour Organization's Violence and Harassment Convention acknowledged that gender-based violence and harassment disproportionately affects women and girls. This affects working conditions throughout much of the world. 2021, Finland's Minister of Justice said that violence against women is a serious human rights and equality problem in Finland, as her government puts forward a proposal for a national rapporteur to tackle the issues of domestic abuse and violence against women. 2021, Brazil passed a law to deal with political violence against women only. Over 180 countries now have specific legislation on domestic violence, though not all of them are openly sexist. That is just a small sample of the laws created as a result of just one area of international pressure. There are, of course, national differences, but the overall intent, trend, and manner of feminist funding is global, so things like protection orders that make a man homeless upon a simple accusation, guidance that steers people away from considering anyone as a victim other than a woman, the broadening of definitions to include even denying a woman money to buy illegal drugs. These are commonly found across nations, and that is because there's a common base to them all. Such laws, training programs and regulations are brought into being in countries despite them having signed treaties to treat men and women the same under law. Everything you campaign for, everything that made you want to support men's rights, everything you suffer from just for being male, has a direction and implementation from outside your country. Some years ago, while I was working with an international men's forum, I discovered something that shook me. I discovered things that changed the way I look upon the struggle for men to achieve their human rights. There was a time when feminists would talk of equality of opportunity, and yet in just 6 months they had dropped that around the world and started to push what they call equality of outcome. This led me to suspect that feminism was not just some ground-up movement, not some movement operating by the usual methods of sharing and growing. It was a top-down, direction-driven plan. But don't worry about what gender equality really means. The UN is already moving on to discuss gender parity. The extent to which feminism has control of the world is still little understood in the men's rights movement. It will help your understanding of men's issues at the international level if you realise just how well entrenched is the main obstacle to men's human rights in the United Nations. Much of it started with what, today, we would look upon as women's rights. Feminism generally came along after and took over. Way back in 1888, an International Congress of Women was held in the USA, which led to the formation of the International Council of Women, headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland. In 1904, what today is known as the International Alliance of Women was formed. Initially conceived as a woman-only suffrage collection of organisations, it later became a wider women's issues collective before morphing in today's powerful international feminist organisation. In 1915, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was created. This was openly feminist and quite hard-line from the outset. Like the International Council of Women, it was started in the USA, but later kept a headquarters in Switzerland. Incidentally, the IAW Congress in the late 1920s had over 40 countries represented, with hundreds of attendees. This at a time when some nations were still developing their postal service, and travel for some would still be on sailing ships. Compare this with the modern men's rights movement in the age of instant communications and relatively cheap airfare. In 1920, the Treaty of Versailles officially ended the First World War, and part of that treaty was the creation of the League of Nations, intending primarily as first international body to encourage peace between nations. The League understood that economic pressures and social discrimination were factors that encouraged war, so it was involved from the outset in seeing what it could do to prevent wars by getting involved in the economic and cultural life of nations. It didn't take long before the League of Nations had specific women's committees and branches as part of its makeup, and it is about this time that the beginnings of what we now know as violence against women concept came into being, linked into the move for peace. Yes, this is 100 years ago, and it affects our lives today. On 24th October 1945, the United Nations was created, and by 1947 had absorbed every aspect of the League of Nations. United Nations was not a brand new start. It literally took over from the League of Nations. This included the committees for women, and the concept to concentrate on violence against women, even though a year later the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights specifically include the concept of equality for all men and women. Just in case you're unaware of what the most fundamental human rights treaty says, here's one sentence from Article 7 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All are equal before the law, and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. The earliest feminist organisation within the UN, called the Commission on the Status of Women, was created in 1946 as a subcommittee of ECOSOC, which is one of the most influential councils of the UN, comprising 54 UN members and voted annually by the General Assembly. That's the Parliament of United Nations. Also in 1946, the Division for the Advancement of Women, DAW, was established, which had a direct link to the Secretary-General, the President of the UN. UN feminists talk freely with the International Alliance of Women, the ICW and others, and pass their requirements for action directly into ECOSOC. This structure persists even today, along with many more feminist connections into the UN. A few days before Christmas 1979, the UN General Assembly adopted a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. The UN has never had a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against men, though this has been proposed by various allies in the global men's movement. The main UN website proudly announces the birth of global feminism as 1985, but the global focus on women only was already well entrenched before that point. The think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations, in a 1995 article Reforming the United Nations, wrote, "States touchy about sovereignty and interest groups pushing their agendas must sink their differences and work out a plan to revitalise the world body." For over 40 years, the United Nations has been pushing the idea that equality is only for women. It is up to you individually, whether you accept that or not. An example of the CSW's influence is the World Health Organization document titled Monitoring Health for the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a section on the Index on Health-Related Indicators, differences between females and males. But this actually points to a section headed Women Live Longer Than Men, but the additional years are not always healthy. So even when men are clearly the losers, in a way that no other human right can trump, since the first part of getting human rights has to be being alive, the focus is redirected to women, without any examination of whether men's final years are always healthy, which of course they are not. 30 years after the CSW was formed, a full-blown feminist agency was created at the top level of the United Nations. UNIFEM was created in 1976 as an overtly feminist council within the UN, directly reporting to the General Assembly, like only a few other UN councils. Even as it was created, the UN stated that other parts of the UN system, such as UNICEF, UNDP and UNFPA, will continue to have responsibility to work for gender equality and women's empowerment. As you might expect, gender equality, in reality, has nothing to do with improving men's rights, dignities, or equality. Feminism was not restricted to influencing the General Assembly through UNIFEM, but was also influencing all the other councils who reported to the General Assembly, including a direct line into the UN Secretariat via the Office of the Special Advisor on Gender Issues. As you can guess, gender issues never included men or boys. From 1995, the gender mainstreaming policy in the UN meant that everyone in the UN had to ensure that what they were doing was not against gender equality, which effectively means they must pass everything they were doing via feminists for approval. In 2000, 157 participating governments adopted our Nairobi forward-looking strategies, a document which broke new ground by openly declaring all issues to be of interest for UN feminists. This effectively gives the UN feminists a veto or an amendment on any action taken by any part of the UN, with an exception of UNSEC, those guys in the white vehicles and blue hats. Though even there I have found UN documents dating back to at least 2019 that talk of having a feminist Security Council. The General Secretary has announced a drive to include more women in peacekeeping roles, and the feminist NGO WLPF are engaging on it. the feminist control continues to expand. It took a strong turn in 2006 with Resolution CEB 2006-2, an internal executive decision to concentrate the UN on gender issues and the advancement of women. In 2010, DAW, INSTRAW, OSAGI, UNIFEM and some of the other feminist groups scattered throughout the UN came under the umbrella of one much bigger UN Women. Most of these feminist groups still exist, now both within the specific agency of the United Nations, as well as being directed by those with the power and control in UN Women. Today, most of the major UN bodies, such as UNESCO, the ICJ, SRSG, and the WHO, have their own section of feminists. Supplementing all these are feminist NGOs like the IAW, WALPF, and ICW, interacting directly with the likes of UN Habitat, CEDAW, CERD, and UNIDO. I have just breezed through some of the alphabet soup of the UN. Like the League of Nations, the UN has expanded and defined its own brief so that it involves itself in the discourse on science, general education standards, cultural harmony and distinction, entertainment, political structure. It laughingly pretends to promote democracy, yet is the least democratic organisation that rules you. Social structure, national legislation, suffrage, only for women of course, disease including AIDS, health, family planning, eugenics, euthanasia, and geronticide, yes seriously, trade and commerce, all kinds of standards from food and cars to the computer I'm using, international finance and credit, fishing rights, monetary control, mostly through the IMF and the World Bank, violence against women, outer space, women's rights, feminist style only, employment and unemployment, immigration, sanitation, slavery, deep-sea exploration, infrastructure, roads, rails, etc., housing construction, air traffic, and much more. And all of this is effectively controlled, or at least infected and policed by, feminists. Anne-Marie Goetz, a former Director of Peace and Security at UN Women, said of the agency recently, UN Women is the most significant example globally of institutionalizing the commitment to gender equality at the heart of a multilateral institution. And she pointed out that the rank of its executive director and her position on the Secretary-General's Executive Committee are signs that women's rights are recognized to be central to global governance, peace, and development. I will say again, there is no such recognition in the United Nations for men's rights, nor for the rights of women outside of feminist political ideology, nor for children who suffer and die in their millions through feminist-promoted agenda. I know that you are happy that women who are mistreated are helped. It is a normal, masculine trait to want to protect women and children. And if feminism constrained itself to helping women in need, and was not a political ideology wanting to disrupt and destroy your culture and way of life, if it fully embraced women's rights in a way that most women could feel it represented their needs, if it did not directly oppose men and children from having their rights and dignitaries, we would not be concerned. We would not need to be concerned. We are in an ideological battle for which we are not naturally suited. Feminists claim to support women, and we want to help women too. We can't help that. One attraction of women to the men's movement is that they recognise that we are people who care about women, as well, of course, about men and children. In early 2021, I took part in a UN humanitarian conference. This is supposedly about organisations and individuals coming together to discuss various humanitarian issues and cross-national responses. A quote from the name of one of the sessions: "Disrupting power and organisational culture. taking gender equality and women's empowerment beyond protection. It's not like this stuff is hidden. They aren't shouting about what they're up to. They don't mind the silly rumour that the United Nations are the good guys, or that feminism is all about equality. But the truth, and it is visible to those who look, is very different. They are planning, openly, the destruction of social structures that people rely on for security and survival. Eric Lowe, a retired professor in political communication and neo-Marxism, said feminist activists were extraordinarily successful at spreading their ideas. We have to become good at doing the same. We have to take the sex war that the feminists declared upon us seriously. We are in a war. We can't even say that it is a war in which men are not dying. They are, not only by suicide, domestic violence and homelessness, but with 5 years less average lifespan that society should be screaming about. Children are dying too, even more than men. We cannot stand by passively. We, the masculine men, must get involved in this war, to fight for the rights and dignitaries and the very lives of men and children. While there is a great deal of bad news for men, children, families and women in international affairs, there are the odd spots of good news. Even the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization have recently announced that ischemic heart disease and stroke, which have increased by more than a quarter this century, are partly due to high working hours, causing deaths that are overwhelmingly male. There are people working on behalf of families and even directly on behalf of men and children who are already making an impression. Indeed, this year AWID, one of the most powerful global feminist organizations, has started to demand greater feminist purity within the United Nations, calling for an end to what they call anti-rights actors, conservatives, and even having the cheek to ask the UN to reject all attempts to pit the rights of any one group against another, as though this isn't what they do every week themselves. Of course, AWID don't show any examples, nor do they dare point out that the men's rights movement would be very happy to talk about equality and an end to the sex war that feminists like them started in the 1970s. So there are efforts being made for reasonableness and an end to sexism, and those efforts are being felt. Mostly the groups making waves so far are religious groups, family and child-centric organisations. The men's rights movement has yet to make itself felt in the way that it can. Just remember, every organisation is run by people. They are just people. The massive size and scope of the United Nations that I have emphasised to this point can be brought down to the level of dealing with individuals at a level you are able to address. Although the United Nations is a feminist organisation, many working in it are not feminists. It is possible to ensure that men and children get fair treatment just by pointing out their need, backed up by official documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have allies already taking on the United Nations, and their guidance and experience is helpful. You will also find individuals who will help and give support, or whom you can give support to. We are a long way from ridding international bodies from corrupting ideologies, but we have to start. We have to nullify harmful influences at international level, while working to replace them with morality that fits with what the world wants. You can make a difference. Sometimes, like in that humanitarian conference, all you can do is ask questions. But the more you ask those questions, even if they don't get answered, the more you will cause people to think. It can be difficult to tie down just what and where the UN is. Some groups aren't officially part of the UN, but are under one form of control or another of one or more UN agencies. Usually the control is financial, but sometimes an organisation is operated as an independent agency, but by UN staff. Ignore the simplistic information on the UN, but don't be bewildered by the complexity either. Part of the confusion comes about from the range of various bodies that are part of the UN. Lots of the main bodies have spin-offs of various types, and those spin-offs then hold conferences which form commissions to examine something, which decide to have subcommittees that build departments, which have seminars, well, you get the idea. As a simple example, although there is a UN university, there are at least 3 independent academies, each operated by a different part of the UN. One of the best ways to start to ease yourself into international bodies is through your work, profession, training, or your hobby interests. These are areas you already have some understanding of, and you may find it easier to be involved in a field where you already know the technical jargon and only need to learn the jargon of international relations and global feminism. Many UN bodies have national components, or already have regular input from a national body in your country. National feminist organisations interact directly with these, increasing the national and international impact. You can do the same, getting involved, perhaps being the lone voice pointing out that there is a need to care for men as well as women, and making sure that children are not left behind in the rush to conform to feminism. You are likely to make enemies among those who want women's rights to be degraded still further, but you are also likely to find some friends and allies. But you have to be savvy about things. You have to be able to really read what is stated and understand why something is worded the way it is. As a quick example, one of the UN's special rapporteurs on violence against women once visited women in Australian prisons. Like most places, women make up a tiny proportion of prisoners, well below the proportion of crimes women commit. The rapporteur said, "Most of the women I visited were incarcerated for minor non-violent offences, such as stealing, fraud, and breaches of domestic violence orders. It would be very easy to think that most women in Australian prison were in there for minor offences. That's what she said, isn't it?" Listen again. "Most of the women I visited were incarcerated for minor, non-violent offences, such as stealing, fraud, and breaches of domestic violence orders." You have to train yourself to ask the right question. In this case, the question is, why did the Special Rapporteur only visit women incarcerated for minor offences? Most women are incarcerated in Australia for heinous crimes. Thanks largely to COVID, a lot more of the United Nations agencies are holding meetings electronically. That trend is being pushed to be continued, making the meetings more open to more people at lower cost. Search to see if there are meetings you can attend in an area of interest. Don't expect to be able to do more than listen in and learn initially. Becoming active to the point of making an impact is likely to take time. Best wishes to you, and be assured that you will find friends along the way.